The soft hum of the engines had become a familiar sound to Selena Vaughn. As she guided the Boeing 787 through the final descent into Los Angeles International Airport, her hands remained steady on the controls, her mind sharp despite the exhaustion creeping in. She had been flying for over 10 hours, a transatlantic flight from Paris to LA, yet the responsibility on her shoulders kept her alert. Flight 227 cleared to land on runway 24L. The air traffic controller's voice came through her headset. "Copy that. Cleared to land 24 Lima," she responded, her voice calm, professional. The city stretched out beneath her, a sea of twinkling lights against the darkening sky. It was a sight she never tired of. Yet tonight, there was a weight pressing down on her chest. As the aircraft touched down smoothly, the passengers erupted in polite applause, something she had come to expect on long-haul flights. A habit people had, as if the landing was some miraculous feat rather than the result of years of training and precision. Celine didn't mind. She knew she was damn good at her job, but that didn't mean everyone else did. Once the plane taxied to the gate, Celine completed her post-flight checklist, making sure every detail was logged before stepping out of the cockpit. As she walked down the aisle toward the exit, she overheard a hushed conversation between two passengers in first class. "I still can't believe the pilot was a woman," a man in an expensive suit murmured to his companion. "And black, no less," the other added, shaking his head as if it were some cosmic joke. Celine didn't stop. She didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. It wasn't the first time she had heard comments like that, and it sure wouldn't be the last, but it still stung. She exited the jet bridge, inhaling the familiar scent of airport terminals. Coffee, jet fuel, and the distant tang of cleaning agents. Pulling her overnight bag onto her shoulder, she checked her phone. A single text from an old friend popped up. "Dinner at La Bellevue?" "My treat," Celine exhaled, a slow smile forming on her lips. La Bellevue, one of the most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurants in Beverly Hills. It wasn't her usual post-flight routine, but after a week of grueling schedules, a good meal sounded like the perfect way to unwind. With a quick reply, she confirmed the reservation and headed toward the exit, stepping into the warm California night. She had no idea that in just an hour she would be standing at the entrance of that very restaurant, not as a welcomed guest, but as an unwelcome presence. Celine stepped out of the sleek black car and adjusted the collar of her fitted blazer. The city lights shimmered against the polished glass exterior of La Bellevue, one of the most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurants in Beverly Hills. Everything about it exuded wealth, the golden lighting spilling onto the sidewalk, the soft hum of conversation from well-dressed patrons on the terrace, the valet dressed sharper than some corporate executives. She took a deep breath, smoothing down her navy blue trousers. Tonight was supposed to be a quiet evening, just good food and even better company. As she approached the entrance, the maître d', a thin man with perfectly combed silver hair, glanced up from his podium. His name tag read Marshall Tate. His sharp gaze flickered over her once, taking in her appearance, and something in his expression changed. "Good evening, ma'am," he said smoothly, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes, under the name Holloway." At the mention of the name, Marshall's lips twitched, his fingers gliding over the reservation list. Then his brow furrowed, and he let out a slow exhale. "I'm terribly sorry, but we have a strict dress code here. We require formal evening wear for all guests." Celine blinked, taken aback. She glanced down at herself. Her tailored blazer, crisp blouse, and perfectly fitted trousers were more than appropriate. She had been to high-end establishments before. This was hardly out of place. "Is that so?" she said, tilting her head. "Because I see plenty of men in jackets just like mine." Marshall let out a polite chuckle, the kind that dripped with condescension. "I understand, but our policy is quite firm. We strive to maintain a certain ambiance, you see." Celine crossed her arms. "So what exactly about my outfit doesn't meet your standards?" Marshall's smile faltered. "I'm afraid I can't make exceptions, ma'am." Celine felt a slow burn creeping up her spine. She had seen this tactic before. Vague rules, conveniently applied when someone didn't fit the mold of what people expected. "Right," she said, pulling out her phone. Then let me call Mr. Holloway. I'm sure he'll be very interested to know why his guest isn't allowed in. Marshall's face flickered with something unreadable before smoothing into careful neutrality. There's no need for that. However, all tables are fully booked tonight. Celine arched a brow. So which is it? My outfit or the non-existent tables? Marshall exhaled sharply through his nose. Ma'am, I suggest you find another establishment that is more fitting for someone like me. Celine finished for him, her voice flat. Marshall didn't respond. He didn't have to. The realization settled over her like a cold wave. It wasn't her outfit. It wasn't the reservations. It was her. Celine let out a slow, measured breath, then took a step back. Not out of defeat, but calculation. She tapped her phone screen and pressed a contact. Preston, she said smoothly when the call connected. I just arrived, but there seems to be a situation at the entrance. Marshall's expression stiffened at the mention of the name. Stay where you are. Preston Holloway's voice came through, even and controlled. I'll be there in 5. Celine ended the call, sliding her phone back into her pocket. Then she looked up at Marshall and smiled. A calm, knowing smile. Looks like I'll be waiting, she said. Marshall straightened his shoulders, but she saw it, the slight shift of discomfort in his posture. She folded her arms and turned her gaze to the lavish restaurant behind him, standing her ground as the seconds ticked by. 5 minutes. That was all it would take before everything changed. Celine didn't have to wait long. The rhythmic click of polished dress shoes against the pavement signaled his arrival before she even turned to see him. Preston Holloway exuded authority in a way that wasn't forced. It was simply embedded in the way he moved, the way people instinctively stepped aside for him. Dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, he carried himself with the ease of a man who had nothing to prove, yet whose presence demanded respect. Celine, he greeted, his deep voice carrying through the night air as he approached. She turned, meeting his gaze with a calm she didn't quite feel. Preston, I hope I didn't interrupt anything important. His lips quirked into a smirk. Nothing as important as this. He barely spared Marshall Tate a glance as he stepped past him and offered Celine his arm. She took it, letting him lead her toward the entrance like they had every right to be there. Because they did. Marshall cleared his throat. Mr. Holloway, Preston finally turned his attention to him, one eyebrow arched in silent expectation. The maitre d' seemed to shrink under his gaze. There appears to have been some sort of misunderstanding, Marshall continued, his voice now carefully polite. A misunderstanding, Preston echoed, his tone neutral. Is that so? Marshall nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. It seems there was an issue with Ms. Vaughn's reservation, but I assure you, we're more than happy to accommodate her now. Celine fought the urge to scoff. She knew exactly what this was. Damage control. Preston tilted his head slightly as if considering the words. And yet, 5 minutes ago, she wasn't allowed in. Care to explain why? Marshall hesitated, clearly scrambling for an answer that wouldn't make things worse. Celine decided to help him out. Apparently my attire wasn't up to the restaurant's standards, she said smoothly, glancing down at her impeccably tailored ensemble. Preston let out a low hum of amusement. Interesting, because I recall seeing at least 3 other guests in nearly identical outfits on my way in. Marshall's jaw tightened. Mr. Holloway, I assure you. Preston held up a hand, silencing him. His expression remained unreadable, but the authority in his posture was unmistakable. Marshall, he said evenly, I've been a loyal patron of La Bellevue for years. I've hosted business deals here, dined with foreign diplomats, and spent more money than I care to count. And in all that time, I've never once seen someone turned away over a dress code issue, until tonight. Marshall swallowed hard, his collar suddenly seeming a bit too tight. Sir, Let me be perfectly clear, Preston continued, his voice like steel wrapped in silk. This is not about policy. This is about the way you choose to enforce it. And if that's how La Bellevue operates, then I'll be taking my business elsewhere. Permanently. Celine felt the tension ripple through the space between them. Guests at nearby tables had begun to take notice, their conversations dropping to whispers. The weight of the moment settled over Marshall like a vice. That won't be necessary, sir, he said quickly, his voice losing its previous arrogance. Ms. Vaughn is more than welcome to dine here tonight. And of course, we'd like to offer our sincerest apologies for the— Don't bother, Celine interjected, her voice steady. I have no interest in eating somewhere I wasn't welcome in the first place. Marshall flinched, but she didn't care. She had spent her entire career fighting to be seen as more than just an exception, more than just a novelty in an industry dominated by men who never had to prove themselves the way she did. And now, standing here, she realized she had no desire to prove anything to someone like Marshall Tate. Preston smiled as if he had been waiting for her to say exactly that. Well, that settles it then, he said, turning to Celine. Shall we find somewhere else? She nodded. Let's. As they turned to leave, Preston glanced over his shoulder one last time. Oh, and Marshall? The maitre d' straightened, his expression rigid. Sir? You should start looking for another job, Preston said casually, because by tomorrow morning, you won't have this one. And with that, they walked away, leaving Marshall standing there, his carefully curated world crumbling around him. Marshall Tate stood frozen, his mind racing as Preston Holloway and Celine Vaughn disappeared into the night. The weight of what had just transpired pressed down on him, each breath growing heavier. He had built his career on the illusion of control, on knowing who belonged and who didn't. And now, with just a few words, Preston had shattered that control like glass. Inside La Bellevue, the atmosphere had shifted. Whispers spread among the diners, some casting furtive glances toward the entrance, others pretending not to notice the tension that had unfolded before them. A few regulars murmured their discontent, not with Celine, but with Marshall. At the corner of the restaurant, seated alone with a glass of red wine, Eleanor Hastings, the restaurant's co-owner, observed everything in silence. She was in her late 50s, a woman who had spent decades curating La Bellevue's reputation as an elite sanctuary. And now, thanks to Marshall's arrogance, that reputation teetered on the edge of disaster. Marshall turned, expecting to see his staff busying themselves with their work, pretending nothing had happened. Instead, he found Daniel Liu, one of the senior waiters, watching him with an unreadable expression. Something you need, Daniel, Marshall snapped, his voice low. Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. No, sir. But there was something in his eyes, something that made Marshall's stomach churn. A sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Marshall? He turned to see Eleanor Hastings rising from her seat, her expression unreadable, but her posture radiating controlled fury. She beckoned him with a single finger. Come with me, she said. Marshall swallowed hard. He had been working at La Bellevue for years, long enough to know that when Eleanor called for a private discussion, it was never a good sign. They stepped into her office, the air thick with tension. Eleanor closed the door softly before turning to face him. What the hell were you thinking? She asked, her voice quiet but laced with steel. Marshall opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off. Do you have any idea who you just insulted? She stepped forward, her gaze drilling into him. Celine Vaughn is one of the top pilots in the country. Preston Holloway is not just a billionaire. He's one of our most valuable patrons. And now, thanks to your judgment, we are at risk of losing more than just his business. Marshall bristled, straightening his shoulders. I was enforcing the restaurant's policies. She wasn't dressed. Don't insult my intelligence, Eleanor snapped. This wasn't about dress code, and you damn well know it. She turned toward her desk and grabbed her phone. I've already received 3 calls in the past 10 minutes. This is going to be in the press, Marshall. People are already talking. Do you have any idea what this could do to us? Marshall felt his palms grow clammy. I can fix this, he said quickly. You'll do nothing, Eleanor interrupted. You're done here. For the first time that night, genuine panic clawed at Marshall's chest. Wait, you've made this restaurant a liability, she said coldly. Pack your things. Security will escort you out. Marshall's throat tightened, his mind scrambling for something, anything to salvage this. But there was nothing. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that he was the one deciding who belonged and who didn't, and now he was the one being shut out. Eleanor turned toward the door, signaling the end of the conversation. But before she opened it, she glanced back at him one last time. Next time, she said, her voice eerily calm. Remember that power isn't about keeping people out. It's about knowing when to let the right ones in. And just like that, the door closed behind her, leaving Marshall standing alone in the office that was no longer his. Marshall Tate walked out of LaBelle View for the last time, his steps slow, deliberate, but weighed down by the crushing reality of his downfall. The night air felt different, thicker, suffocating. He had strutted through these doors for years, holding his head high, believing he was the gatekeeper to one of the most exclusive establishments in Beverly Hills. Now he was just another man on the sidewalk, discarded without ceremony. The valet barely spared him a glance. The hostess he had barked orders at for months looked right through him. Even Daniel, the senior waiter, who had always kept his head down, held a trace of something close to satisfaction in his gaze. He clenched his jaw, pushing forward into the night, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had a list of contacts, investors, restaurant owners, people who owed him favors. He would land on his feet. Wouldn't he? As he scrolled through his phone, one name stood out. Victor Langley, an old friend and influential figure in the hospitality industry. If anyone could salvage this mess, it was him. Marshall hit dial, pressing the phone to his ear as he reached his car. Marshall, Victor answered, his tone neutral. Vic, I need a favor, Marshall started, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm in a bit of a situation, but... I know, Victor interrupted, his voice lacking its usual warmth. Everyone knows. Marshall's grip tightened on the steering wheel. What are you talking about? A sigh. Marshall, it's already online. The video, the story, everything. LaBelle View is trending for all the wrong reasons, and your name is at the center of it. Marshall's stomach dropped. Look, Victor continued, I don't know if I can help you. No one wants to be associated with a scandal like this. Hell, my partners are already talking about pulling out of anything that connects to LaBelle View. You should lay low for a while. Lay low? The word stung worse than the actual firing. Come on, Vic, Marshall said, forcing a chuckle that came out hollow. This will blow over. It's just some internet noise. In a week, no one will even... It's not just noise, Victor cut in, his voice sharper. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about every high-end restaurant that people suspect of discrimination. You were just dumb enough to be caught on camera. Marshall had no response. Look, I have to go, Victor said after a pause. Take care of yourself. And just like that, the line went dead. Marshall tossed his phone onto the passenger seat and stared at the dashboard. His reflection in the rearview mirror looked different. For the first time, he felt small. Marshall sat motionless in his car, the weight of Victor's words sinking deep into his bones. The streetlights cast a dull glow over his dashboard, illuminating the faint wrinkles on his forehead, the tension clenching his jaw. This wasn't just a setback, it was an erasure. His name, his career, everything he had built was unraveling at an alarming speed. With a sharp breath, he grabbed his phone again, this time pulling up social media. And there it was. The incident at LaBelle View had already gone viral. A shaky cell phone video had captured everything. His cold dismissal of Celine, Preston Holloway's confrontation, and the moment when his arrogance cracked under the weight of his own rules. The caption underneath read, "When a Michelin-starred restaurant thinks dress codes are more important than dignity." Let her dine. The comments were brutal. This is exactly why we need to start exposing places like this. He really thought he was untouchable. Not so powerful now, huh? Imagine how many times he's done this before without getting caught. It wasn't just one video. News articles were already circulating. Influencers were weighing in. Even some celebrities had shared the post, calling out the industry for its silent, systematic discrimination. Marshall scrolled with shaking fingers. It was everywhere. Then a headline from a major news site made his breath catch in his throat. LaBelle View under fire, discriminatory practices uncovered. He clicked the article, his heart pounding. It wasn't just about him anymore. Former employees had started coming forward. Anonymous testimonies exposed how he had turned away guests he deemed unworthy, how he had ignored complaints from staff about racial bias, how he had subtly trained employees to prioritize a certain clientele. Marshall's head spun. This wasn't supposed to happen. The restaurant's official statement had already been posted. He opened it, skimming through the carefully crafted words. La Bellevue does not condone discrimination of any kind. We take this matter seriously and have taken swift action. The individual responsible is no longer employed with us, and we are implementing changes to ensure inclusivity at all levels. That was it. A cold, clinical detachment from him, as if he had never been an integral part of the establishment. They had thrown him away without hesitation. A surge of anger flooded his chest. He had given years to that place, molded it, shaped its exclusivity. And now, he was the villain, while they wiped their hands clean, pretending they hadn't benefited from it all along. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Welcome to rock bottom. Hope it's comfortable." Marshall gritted his teeth. He wouldn't go down like this. His career wasn't over. It couldn't be, not if he fought back. Marshall paced in his dimly lit apartment, phone in one hand, whiskey glass in the other. The headlines wouldn't stop coming. Every hour, another piece of his reputation was chipped away, another article dissecting his past decisions, his management style, his so-called legacy at La Bellevue. He had lost control of the narrative, and Marshall Tate was not the kind of man who went down without a fight. He pulled up a contact on his phone. Daniel Ross, a crisis management consultant. If anyone could help him salvage what was left of his name, it was Ross. The phone rang twice before a clipped professional voice answered. "Marshall," Ross greeted, no warmth in his tone. "I was wondering when you'd call." Marshall exhaled sharply. "You've seen the mess." "I've seen it," Ross confirmed. "And I'll be honest, your name is toxic right now. No one wants to be associated with you. Every PR firm in town is advising their clients to distance themselves." Marshall clenched his jaw. "I need a strategy, a way to flip this." Ross sighed. "Your best move? Lay low. Let this burn out on its own. The more you fight back, the worse it'll get." "That's not an option," Marshall snapped. "I've worked too hard to let this define me." There was a pause, then Ross spoke carefully. "There's one way, but it's risky." Marshall leaned forward, gripping his glass tighter. "I'm listening." "You could turn the tables," Ross said. "Claim you were a scapegoat. That La Bellevue threw you under the bus to save themselves." Marshall frowned. "They did throw me under the bus." "Exactly," Ross said smoothly. "If you spin this right, you could make it seem like you were just following the culture they encouraged, that you were enforcing policies that the restaurant had always had in place. Shift the blame." Marshall considered it. The idea had merit. If he could redirect the heat toward La Bellevue itself, maybe he could claw his way back. But Ross wasn't done. "One more thing," he added. "You need a public apology, a carefully worded, controlled statement. Make it sound like you acknowledge the mistake, but also make it clear that the system failed you too." Marshall bristled at the thought of apologizing, but he knew Ross was right. He had to play this strategically. "Fine," he said. "Draft the statement." "Already ahead of you," Ross said. "I'll send you something in an hour. But Marshall, if this backfires, you'll lose whatever sliver of credibility you have left." Marshall exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't have a choice." An hour later, Marshall sat at his kitchen counter, staring at the drafted statement Ross had sent him. It was carefully crafted, the kind of damage control that walked the tightrope between taking responsibility and subtly shifting blame. "I deeply regret the events that transpired at La Bellevue. It was never my intention to make any guest feel unwelcome, and I now recognize that my actions contributed to a situation that should never have occurred. However, it is also important to acknowledge that I was operating within a culture that prioritized exclusivity over inclusivity. The policies I enforced were not mine alone. They were part of a larger system that I now realize must change. I take full responsibility for my role, but I also hope this moment sparks a greater conversation about the hospitality industry as a whole." Marshall read it over and over, rolling the words around in his mind. It was strategic, clever even. It gave the public what they wanted, a semblance of remorse, while subtly suggesting that he was just a product of his environment. But something about it didn't sit right, because the truth was, he wasn't sorry, not really. He had spent years building La Bellevue into a sanctuary for the elite, curating its clientele to uphold a certain image. He had believed in what he was doing. And now, because of one night, because of one woman, it was all gone. He set his phone down and reached for his whiskey glass, swirling the amber liquid before taking a slow sip. Then an idea struck him. What if, instead of playing defense, he went on offense? He picked up his phone and dialed Ross. "I'm not releasing this statement," he said the moment Ross answered. A pause, then, "Marshall, that's a mistake." "No," Marshall said, a slow smirk creeping onto his face. "The mistake was letting them paint me as the villain without telling my side of the story." Ross sighed. "What exactly are you planning?" Marshall leaned back, tapping his fingers against the counter. "I'm going to tell the truth," he said, "but not the version they want to hear." Ross's voice tightened. "Meaning?" "Meaning, Monsieur Show," Marshall said. "I'm going to let people know that this wasn't about discrimination. This was about power. La Bellevue has always been exclusive, always catered to a certain class of people, and now, because of one high-profile incident, they're pretending to be something they're not." Ross was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Marshall, if you go down this road, there's no turning back. You're not just distancing yourself from La Bellevue, you're calling out the entire industry." "Good," Marshall said, gripping his glass tighter, "because I refuse to be the only one who burns for this." Marshall sat in front of his laptop, the dim glow of the screen casting sharp shadows across his face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he stared at the statement he was about to release, his own version of the truth. He wasn't going to grovel. He wasn't going to beg for forgiveness. He was going to fight back. With a slow breath, he began typing. "For years, La Bellevue has built its reputation on exclusivity. That wasn't just my doing. It was the foundation of the entire establishment. The policies I enforced weren't created by me. They were part of a culture that has long dictated who belongs in high society and who doesn't. Yet when the public needed someone to blame, I was thrown under the bus, fired, erased, as if I was the only one who ever upheld these so-called standards. So let's be honest. This isn't about one moment, one mistake, or one guest being denied entry. This is about an industry that thrives on gatekeeping but folds the second it faces backlash." La Bellevue wasn't upset about what happened that night. They were upset that they got caught. If the world wants change, then let's change. But let's not pretend that I was the only one upholding the rules they all benefited from. He leaned back, reading over his words. It wasn't an apology. It was a challenge. With one last glance, he hit post. Within minutes, notifications began exploding across his phone. Did this man really just throw his entire industry under the bus? Wait, so he's saying La Bellevue was always like this? This guy really thought he was making a comeback, but he just admitted he's been a problem for years. La Bellevue, care to comment? The conversation shifted. Instead of Marshall being the sole villain, people started turning their attention to the restaurant itself. And then, something he didn't expect. A former La Bellevue employee commented on his post. "He's not lying. The whole place operated on unspoken rules about who fit the brand, and management encouraged it." More comments flooded in, more voices speaking up. It was working. Marshall smirked, watching as the tides began to turn. Maybe he wasn't finished after all. Marshall leaned back in his chair, watching the numbers climb. His post was spreading like wildfire, pulling La Bellevue deeper into the fire with every passing hour. For the first time since this whole disaster began, he felt like he was in control again, until his phone rang. He checked the screen. Unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "This is Marshall." A measured, familiar voice came through the line. "Marshall," Preston Holloway said, smooth as ever. "I figured you'd try something like this." Marshall's grip on the phone tightened. "You sound impressed." Preston let out a slow exhale. "Not quite the word I'd use." Marshall smirked. "You know, for someone who supposedly didn't want to be involved in all of this. You sure seem invested." "I am," Preston admitted, "because you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Marshall's smirk faltered. "Did I?" "Yes," Preston said simply. "You see, before your little manifesto, La Bellevue could have survived this. The restaurant had a future. But now," he let out a low chuckle, You just handed me the final nail in its coffin. Marshall frowned, sitting up straighter. What the hell are you talking about? You thought turning the heat onto La Bellevue would help you? Preston continued. What you didn't realize is that I've been waiting for a reason to buy them out. Marshall's heart stopped. I made an offer months ago, Preston continued, his voice casual. But the owners didn't want to sell. They still believed in their brand. But now, thanks to you, the damage is too great. Their reputation is too far gone. And when that happens, people like me? He let the words hang for a second. We step in. We take over. Marshall's stomach dropped. You played your hand too early, Preston said, and you didn't realize you were holding a losing hand. Marshall shot up from his seat, knocking over his whiskey glass. You think I care about La Bellevue? Let them burn. You don't get it, Preston said, and for the first time there was pity in his voice. I'm not just buying the restaurant, I'm buying everything. The name, the staff, the assets, the entire brand. Marshall's mouth went dry. And that includes, Preston added, every record, every email, every decision you ever made there. Marshall froze. Do you understand what that means? Preston asked, voice smooth as silk. Marshall did. It meant he was done. Because if Preston owned everything, he owned Marshall's mistakes. Every closed-door decision, every backroom policy, all of it was now in the hands of the man who wanted him gone. You think you're the only one who can control a narrative? Preston asked, amusement laced in his words. Think again. A cold sweat formed at the back of Marshall's neck. Preston's voice softened, almost mockingly. Enjoy the show, Marshall. And then the line went dead. Marshall stared at his phone, his mind spiraling. He thought he had played the system, but the system had just played him. Marshall's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he stared at his phone. The call had ended, but Preston's words echoed in his head, tightening around his throat like an iron grip. He had spent the last 24 hours convinced he was winning, that he had turned the tide, shifted the blame, put La Bellevue under the same scrutiny that had buried him. But he hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't realized he was just a pawn in a bigger game. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the latest news updates. Sure enough, his name was still plastered everywhere. But now the headlines had begun to change. Billionaire Preston Holloway set to acquire La Bellevue amidst controversy. New leadership, new vision. Holloway's plan for a more inclusive hospitality industry. Marshall Tate's downfall marks a turning point for luxury dining. Marshall's stomach twisted. Preston hadn't just neutralized him. He had turned himself into the hero. While Marshall had been busy trying to drag the restaurant down with him, Preston had stepped in as the savior. He had let Marshall expose the corruption, let him turn the public against La Bellevue, and then swooped in at the perfect moment to position himself as the solution. This wasn't just about winning. This was about erasing Marshall Tate from the industry entirely. His phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from his attorney. He clicked it open, his pulse thundering in his ears. Marshall, with Preston Holloway now acquiring La Bellevue, there's a strong possibility that legal action could follow regarding past discriminatory policies under your management. Given the public scrutiny and the existing employee testimonies, I strongly advise we discuss options for damage control and mitigation immediately. Call me as soon as possible. Marshall's vision blurred. This wasn't just about public opinion anymore. This was about survival. If Preston owned the records, the emails, the transactions, the internal documents, he could bury Marshall forever. No more second chances. No more bouncing back. This was a death sentence for his career. Marshall shot up from his chair, knocking over his drink. He had to act. He had to find a way out. But deep down, a sinking realization took root. There was no way out. He had already lost. Marshall's world was shrinking by the second. The walls of his once luxurious apartment felt tighter, the air heavier, as reality closed in around him. He paced the room, running a hand through his hair, his mind racing. There had to be a way to turn this around. There had to be an exit, a loophole. But every door he had once relied on was slamming shut. His attorney's warning replayed in his head. Legal action, employee testimonies, the records. If Preston really had everything, Then there was no arguing his way out of this. No PR spin that could rewrite the truth. He had thought he could control the narrative. Instead, he had handed his enemy the script. He sank onto the couch, his hands gripping the sides of his head. Then, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You should talk before it's too late. Meet me at the Regent Hotel, room 926, 1 hour." Marshall's chest tightened. Was this a trap? A setup? But he had nothing left to lose. With a shaky breath, he grabbed his coat and walked out the door. The meeting that changed everything. The Regent Hotel was a quiet five-star establishment, the kind of place where the wealthy handled their dirty business behind closed doors. Marshall stepped into the elevator, watching the numbers tick up. His reflection in the polished metal doors looked different now. Not the powerful gatekeeper of La Bellevue, just a man grasping at straws. He reached room 926, took a slow breath, knocked. The door cracked open, revealing a woman in her early 50s, dressed in a sharp gray blazer. Her dark eyes measured him carefully. "You're late," she said. Marshall frowned. "And you are?" She stepped aside, motioning him in. "Miriam Cole, former senior manager at La Bellevue. And I know exactly how Preston Holloway plans to destroy you." Marshall stiffened. Miriam closed the door, locking it behind her. And just like that, the game was not over yet. Marshall stood just inside the hotel room, his pulse pounding in his ears as he sized up Miriam Cole. He had never met her personally, but he knew who she was. A former senior manager at La Bellevue, she had left just before the scandal erupted. He had assumed it was just a coincidence. Now he wasn't so sure. Miriam crossed the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she poured herself a glass of water. "You really pissed off the wrong man," she said, taking a sip. Marshall clenched his jaw. "Tell me something I don't know." Miriam smirked. "Fine. How about this? Preston Holloway didn't just acquire La Bellevue to bury you. He had been planning this for months. He just needed the right moment to strike." Marshall's breath hitched. Miriam continued. "He didn't just want the restaurant. He wanted to expose the entire high-end dining industry, make himself the face of reform. And you," she tilted her head, "you were the perfect fall guy." Marshall swallowed hard. "So he set me up?" Miriam let out a dry laugh. "Not exactly. You set yourself up. You just made it easier for him." She walked over to the desk, pulling out a flash drive. "Inside this," she said, holding it up, "is something Preston doesn't have." Marshall narrowed his eyes. "And what's that?" Miriam's expression turned serious. "Proof that Holloway isn't as clean as he pretends to be. Documents, emails, deals he's made in the past that don't exactly fit his progressive image. If this gets out, he won't be the hero of this story anymore." Marshall's stomach tightened. This was his way out, his only way out. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. "Why are you giving this to me?" he asked, his voice careful. Miriam exhaled, setting the flash drive down. "Because Holloway forced me out too. He made it clear that I didn't fit into his new vision of La Bellevue, and I don't take kindly to being discarded." Marshall stared at the flash drive, the weight of its implications crushing down on him. If this information was real, if he could use it, he wouldn't just survive. He could take Preston Holloway down. But was he willing to play that game? Miriam leaned in, her voice low. "You want to win, Marshall," she whispered. "Then stop playing defense. Hit back." Marshall reached for the flash drive, and in that moment, he knew. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Marshall sat in his car, gripping the flash drive so tightly that his knuckles turned white. This was it, his last chance to turn things around. For the past week, he had been the hunted, the man whose name was dragged through the mud, the man who lost everything. Now he had a choice. He could walk away, accept his defeat, and let Preston Holloway rewrite history. Or he could fight back. The call that changed everything. Marshall exhaled sharply and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts before stopping at a name he never thought he'd call again. Victor Langley, a media mogul, a ruthless businessman, and someone who owed him a favor. He hit dial. Victor picked up on the second ring. "Marshall." I have something you might want to see, Marshall said, his voice steady. Something big. A pause, then, I'm listening. Marshall's lips curled into a smirk. Not over the phone. Let's meet. The power move. 1 hour later, Marshall walked into Victor Langley's private office, a high-rise corner suite overlooking the city. Victor sat behind his desk, studying him with thinly veiled amusement. You look like a man with nothing to lose. Marshall placed the flash drive on the desk and slid it forward. Because I don't. Victor picked it up, turning it between his fingers. And what exactly am I looking at? Evidence, Marshall said. Proof that Preston Holloway isn't the saint he pretends to be. Corrupt deals, payoffs, power plays disguised as reform. Victor raised an eyebrow. And you're handing this over because... Marshall leaned forward. Because if Holloway wants to play kingmaker, I want to remind him that kings can fall. Victor smirked. Now you're talking my language. He plugged the flash drive into his laptop. As he skimmed the files, his expression slowly shifted, from intrigue to something darker. Well, well, Victor murmured. You weren't lying. Marshall crossed his arms. So here's the deal. You break this story. You expose Holloway for the fraud he is. In return, I get my name cleared. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. You really think this will make you a hero? Marshall smirked. I don't need to be a hero. I just need to make sure I'm not the villain. Victor sat back, considering. Then slowly he nodded. This is going to be messy, he said, but it's going to be spectacular. Marshall exhaled. The game wasn't over. It was just getting started. The morning after Marshall handed over the flash drive, the world woke up to chaos. News outlets exploded with headlines. Exclusive. The truth behind Preston Holloway's empire, shady deals, hidden agendas, and power plays. Leaked documents reveal Preston Holloway's business tactics. Is he really the industry savior? From hero to hypocrite, how one billionaire manipulated the system for his own gain. Victor Langley had done exactly what Marshall expected. He had set the world on fire, and at the center of it all was Preston Holloway. The fallout Marshall sat in his apartment, watching the news unfold. Holloway's once pristine reputation was now being ripped apart on live television. Documents obtained by our investigative team reveal that Holloway's reform efforts in the hospitality industry were carefully orchestrated to benefit his own investments while strategically dismantling competitors. Sources claim Holloway pressured LaBellevue's former owners into selling by manufacturing a scandal that would make them desperate to unload the restaurant. Emails suggest that Holloway had knowledge of LaBellevue's exclusionary practices long before the incident with Celine Vaughn, but only chose to act when it was advantageous to him. The public was turning. The man who had positioned himself as a leader of change was now exposed as nothing more than a calculated opportunist. And Marshall? His name was being mentioned, but not as the villain. Instead, the narrative had shifted. While Marshall Tate's actions at LaBellevue remain controversial, today's revelations paint a broader picture. Was he simply a pawn in a larger game? New questions arise. If Holloway orchestrated this, was Tate truly acting alone? For the first time in weeks, Marshall breathed easier. The call that sealed it. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Marshall hesitated, then answered. Yeah? A slow exhale. Then, you think you won? Preston Holloway. Marshall smirked, leaning back in his chair. Oh, I know I did. Preston chuckled, a low, humorless sound. You really believe this changes anything? It already has, Marshall said. Your name is dirt now. A pause. Then Preston's voice dropped to something colder, sharper. You made a mistake, Marshall. Marshall tensed. And what mistake is that? Preston's response was slow, deliberate. You should have made sure I was dead before you buried me. The line went dead. Marshall stared at his phone, his smirk fading. This wasn't over. Marshall sat in silence, Preston's final words still ringing in his ears. You should have made sure I was dead before you buried me. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. For the first time since this all began, Marshall wasn't sure if he had truly won. The reckoning. The news cycle raged on. Holloway's empire was crumbling, his allies abandoning him, his carefully curated image in ruins. Marshall, however, was stuck in limbo. He had survived, yes, but he was still a man without a title, without power, without a future. What now? His phone buzzed again, this time not an unknown number. It was Celine Vaughn. A new path Marshall hesitated before answering. Celine. There was a pause, then her voice came through, cool but measured. I hear you had an interesting few days. Marshall chuckled dryly. You could say that. I read the articles, she continued. Seems like you managed to take down the man who took you down. Yeah, Marshall said, running a hand over his face. And yet, I still feel like I lost. Celine was silent for a moment. Then she said, That's because you were playing for the wrong thing. Marshall frowned. What's that supposed to mean? You spent years trying to control who gets in and who stays out, she said. And look where it got you. Maybe it's time to stop trying to be the gatekeeper. Marshall scoffed. And do what? Celine's response was simple. Something better. For the first time, Marshall had no snarky comeback, no calculated response. Just silence. Because maybe she was right. The final choice. 2 weeks later, Marshall stood at the edge of an airfield. He had spent days thinking about what came next, about how he had spent so much of his life defining worth by exclusivity. But now he had nothing left to protect. As he watched Celine Vaughn step into her cockpit, the sky stretching endlessly before her, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe for the first time, he didn't have to be the one deciding who belonged. Maybe it was time to build something new. Marshall exhaled, and then he walked forward, toward whatever came next.